have a leadership that sought to get us to accept the status quo or the control of the world by the European. You hear some of us saying, well, it's the white man's world, so we may as well learn how to, live in it or get along with it. The assimilationist often accepts, consciously and unconsciously, the idea that the white man will continue to rule the world. And he bases then his ideology and political action on this concept, that somehow our destiny is not to overthrow the white man. Our destiny is not to remove this pathological person. Our destiny is not to suppress and bring these sick people under control, but to heal them in some sort of way, to convert them, to become a part of them. Our destiny is not to see that the very system and the very ideology upon which these oppressors move is one of sickness and insanity, and therefore is in need of replacement by an Afrocentric ideology and a healthy ideology that comes out of our own self-knowing, but a leadership that wants us to accept this sickness as normality and to follow these pathological beings into self-destruction. And consequently, then, you will see the enemy's children, the enemy's personality as held up as normal, as representing the norm. And our behavior, to the degree that it differs from that of our enemies, as being seen as deviant and as abnormal. To the degree where we confuse equality and sameness, where we think in order to be equal or greater than our enemies, we have to be the same as our enemies. To the degree that we thought that differentness represents automatically inferiority. And therefore we become alarmed at anything that says we are somehow different from our enemy. We must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that racism is a sickness, that the exploitation and the wholesale rape and pillaging of the earth by the European represents a pathology and an illness. And therefore, our destiny is not one of trying to become a member of this gang of thieves, but to end this existence here on this earth, to inhibit its rapacious ways, and to bring this group of people to heal. And yet we've had a leadership that makes us think that our only crime has been that we've been left out on the booty of these thieves. And we get a leadership that cries about how we're only getting a certain percentage of their robbery and a certain percentage of their thievery. You must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, it's not about getting a piece of the stolen gains of these people, but it's to stop their thievery and rape of the world, period, as a whole. So it is not about being left out of the mainstream, ladies and gentlemen. It is about bringing into being a new world order. We had a leadership, as I implied in our first statement, and I'm still talking about how we moved away from this Garveyism, that in its ascendance could not love itself except that it was loved by whites. To a good extent, the assimilationist ideology was one that's represented in their Supreme Court struggles that said that black children could not love themselves until they were loved by white children. That the self-hatred that was found in black people was a result of the fact that their masters did not love them. That the lack of self-respect was a result that we were not respected by our oppressors. And therefore, we put our children into school with them very early in life, that they might then get a chance to see that we are really human, that we were just like they. and that then they could come and accept us as they accept themselves. And if they come to accept us as they accept themselves, then we would come to accept ourselves. A very curious kind of ideology in psychology that lays the basis of self-acceptance on the acceptance of our enemies. And therefore, we've been waiting for these last 100 or 200 years for our enemies to love us, for our enemies to accept us, so that we can get around to accepting ourselves. But often I ask the question, what if they never get around to accepting us? What if they never get around to loving us? A people whose love is based upon external sources and who must get around themselves through the love of external people are a people then who are under the control of those external forces and external people. A people who have no will and destiny of their own. A people who ultimately then are reactionary in nature, whose major concern is the attitude of their enemy, who are obsessed, who are compelled to look at their enemy and study their enemy day and night, who make a scholarship of looking at the every move of their enemy and reading the every scintilla of body language of their enemy as a way of determining their own behavior, and therefore never get around to themselves and knowing themselves and accepting and loving themselves. And we've had that kind of leadership. Looking at a minuscule population in the world, a 10% population in the world, as a cue as to how they themselves shall behave. It is a case then of the tail wagging the dog, where the small group of people wags the rest of the world, because the dog is obsessed with trying to catch up with his tail. This leadership then has robbed us of the Marcus Garvey legacy. We have a leadership then that has sold us conspicuous consumption as a way of salvaging our egos, that makes us think that we will be equal to the white man when we can drive the same cars and have the same jobs, when we can sleep in the same beds and buy in the same neighborhoods. A consumer equality. Not an equality of ownership, not a real equality based on wealth. You got a leadership that talks to us about equality of income. And as I've often pointed out before, there is a difference between income and wealth. We will not be equal to the white man when we have an equal income, ladies and gentlemen. Because you see, you can get an income from a salary, but you can also get an income from the ownership of resources. A man can have $1 million worth of land and get an income of $10,000. And a man can get an income of $10,000 working for someone else. And even though you say they have an equal income, they are not equally wealthy. And so you have a leadership then that has sold us on income equality, but not wealth. That means that that's a leadership that's going to look at income instead of the control of African property, instead of the ownership of African property and the ownership of African wealth. A leadership that looks at the amount of consumption as a gauge of its equality, looks at the degree to which it can consume as much as its master as a basis of equality, and not the degree to which it owns its means of productions and has control over its own inherited wealth. And we've had that kind of leadership, and thus we've seen then African people the world over, in this country and on the continent, give up the very basic wealth of their lands, their own lands, and their very basic real estate to their enemies for a few pennies and for materials that fade away and are corrupt and corruptible. We have a leadership then that is not concerned with developing its own productive capacities, but merely with getting a job and being identified with the productive capacities of others, with literally marrying the enemy and thus trying to achieve the status of the enemy through marriage. instead of through strength and power. We have seen then this assimilationist leadership which came to the fore and has pushed back to a degree the nationalist leadership, reign over then the decline of African peoples the world over. The decline in African education, the destruction of the African family, the retardation of African technology, the decline and retardation of African economics, the rampaging of our community by drugs, the colonial occupation of our community by foreign police forces and others who are not members of the African community. When we look then over the past 20, 30, and 40 years, we've seen an assimilationist leadership that has brought us to the terrible moral and economic, social, political, and educational impasse which we are complaining about today. That has made us now face the Howard Beaches and the other kinds of disasters that are occurring daily, that are making us see then racism rear its ugly head in a very direct way on the campuses of Columbia University, the campuses of Massachusetts, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Michigan, the so-called bastions of white liberalism. We must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, then that we cannot put our faith in the goodwill of our enemies. We can only put our faith in our own strength and power. And a leadership then that depends upon converting the white man is a leadership that is placing us in a very perilous situation, and is a leadership that ultimately is placing us in a position to be destroyed.